Do you know what your friends' favorite games are? Not a genre or franchise, but singular, definitive video game. Does it align with the other games they like, or does it stick out like a sore thumb? Maybe it aligns with something on the personality side even. I've had some idea of what a lot of my friends' favorite games were, and really wanted to put it to the test. I flung a Google survey out into our Discord and received some results that more or less completely crushed my assumptions. This multi-part project will entail me playing their favorite games and trying to formulate an idea on the why part, while anchoring it to things that I like and how I know them as a friend or general person. Though, maybe I just wanted some game recommendations outside of what I would normally play. Now I will quickly show a few of my favorite games on screen here to help frame me as a gamer. Yes, I know it contains a few mech or mecha adjacent games, I'm even showing one on screen right now. They also happen to generally be mechanically masochistic games, but I'll try not to let my hubris and preferences cloud my experience with these other games, which, as you would imagine from asking a lot of mid to late 90s kids, will contain plenty of games played earlier on in their lives, with a few exceptions of course. I'm sure nostalgia will play a large role in a lot of my traversal and investigation of this project, so I don't want to get super in-depth on it at this point. Let's also set a quick few ground rules for the series, and that is that I do, contrary to expectation, have a job. I'm not necessarily going to 100% or even beat the games depending on their length, complexity, and how much I've played them before if that's the case. In addition, I also made sure we kept the scope to single-player games because multiplayer would be a whole other can of worms. There are a few games I'll be tackling in here that I've never played in my entire life, so I'm really looking forward to that. The only thing left to do now is to go ahead and start the first game. I've known Trevor the longest of anyone that submitted a game to me, which is kind of funny considering his submission was one of the newest released games on the list. We both picked up Hollow Knight the day it came out. It was on the front page of Steam, and the visual designs, most importantly the price, since I was still in college at the time, were just so appealing, but I don't think either of us actually knew anything at all about the game until that day. We both blew through and 100% the game in just a couple days, and it was one of the biggest standout releases to me in the last handful of years. I know it's this huge, cringy kind of cliche of looking through a video game lens, but it really did kindle some childlike wonder for me again. There's something so disgustingly perfect about Hollow Knight's movement and its weight. It's in that weight and control that reminds me so much of my beloved Mega Man X and Mega Man Zero games, but I'm going to try to articulate how exactly Hollow Knight uses that to its advantage in a totally different way than a lot of other platformers and Metroidvanias I've played. I think it's no secret to anyone in the video game sphere that Hollow Knight's a visual and aesthetic masterpiece, and regardless if the gameplay and influences are your cup of tea or not, I guarantee you've heard at least some of the OST bangers in other YouTube videos, whether you recognize it or not. In particular, off the top of my head, the Greenpath theme, Hornet's theme, which I'll probably use as well in this. I guess I'll keep using Mega Man as a direct comparison for this point. If we're looking at something like, say, the Mega Man Zero games, that instantaneously controlled, snappy weight is the gas pedal and speed. It's the main character, nearly more so than the actual main character, and it's much more your weapon than the actual weapons. This means, though, that more often than not, there's so little time to really consider or appreciate some external factors and love put into the game, like the backgrounds, effects, and designs. You're only aware that your foot has to be down on the gas at all times. And I mean, Zero 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. You saw my grid earlier, and I still want to see as little of each stage as possible when I'm running through. In Hollow Knight, though, movement's different. It's a good friend in the passenger seat or your back seat who's controlling the music and the Google Maps, so you can much more comfortably forget how roundabouts work again. You're allowed to stare at the gorgeous landscapes, what enemies are in the area, and what's above or below you, because you know that responsive control has your back if something suddenly appears. That reactive movement basically never fails unless you yourself jerk the steering wheel just to see what a fire hydrant feels like. I'll get off the weird vehicle analogies now. Also, I have to mention, due to various reasons, I had to play this game with the Steam controller when it came out, so let it be known this game still felt incredible on that thing. Doing things like checking the map, hitting random walls and ceilings to see if an entrance appears, or praying for a new dialogue line to pop up the 6th time I try to marry the shopkeeper.
Papanada.
Oh. There were very few points in this game that I ever felt like I had to hurry up and get a move on. Of course, unless the game clearly wants you to sweat a bit, but in this game, that usually feels limited to boss encounters. I've seen a few people mention how difficult Hollow Knight is, and in most regards, I honestly kind of have to disagree. Are there difficult sections and bosses? Absolutely. I think of the White Palace or Radiant at the end, but running through this game again for the first time since it launched, I really gotta remember how much downtime there really is between all those hectic, intensive instances. You can kill a boss and then just run down slowly and search for more charms or look for the map maker or other items. I learned 5 years ago that an interesting system mechanic like down tilting your aerial attacks lets you do invincible hops, which now on the replay I can just reach items and currency I certainly didn't the first playthrough until I got more movement options. You really feel like a little dude coming to learn more about this underground labyrinth and ecosystem, and seeing a biome and area slowly, or sometimes abruptly, become one you haven't seen before is so genuinely engaging, and you feel so much closer to understanding what the hell's actually going on. I do want to take a moment to discuss environmental storytelling in Hollow Knight because I think it's one of the things the game gets the most right. It's little interactions with Quarrel and Zote throughout the world, the comfort of ringing the bell for the Chad Beetle to hook you up, the slow transition and transformation of the miner on the way to the Crystal Peak, and so many more. I don't know if I'll ever forget hanging out with Quarrel at Blue Lake and realizing way after the fact that on the map it's directly above the City of Tears, where it's always raining. I don't know if I missed it twice now, but I don't think the game ever outright tells you about that. There's something so beautifully haunting about knowing you stepped into a world that's already far past its most exciting and interesting parts. This is highlighted to me by how full of life, relatively speaking, Greenpath is near the top of the map, then, aside the City of Tears, only gets more scarce as we venture further down. I know post-apocalyptic settings are no strange occurrence in video games, but Hollow Knight spins into a significantly more nuanced, self-contained version. I don't really know much of anything about the politics or reasons why this world has ended, except for the scraps the game does feed you, and in my opinion, that's all the better. A lot of games that are post-calamity, nuclear fallout, space colonization, whatever, really feel like they just want to justify the setting so damn badly, because they're scared you're just going to walk out of the door because you've seen it before so many times. Hollow Knight never feels like this. The world's like this because it just is. In terms of games I could have had to replay, Hollow Knight was a huge softball. I do love this game a lot, that's no secret, and I think the whole is so much greater than the pieces, and so many people try to split that apart to try to get friends to play the game, depending on their preferences. If I'm sort of touching on everything, it would be unfair to not mention the combat. No reason to get particularly wordy or anything, but like everything else, it's fantastic. If I had to pick the weakest part of the game, though, this would probably be it, but that's also such a relative-looking nitpick that there isn't much of a point to it. Pointing to the one only pretty clean corner of someone's room would just be so petty. Like I discussed a bit before, the movement is so fluid and responsive that you really feel like even the most difficult fights in the game that you fail a couple times is because your movement was a little off or you were missing a visual or audio cue for the boss attacks. Hitting enemies with your nail feels like a reward for appreciating other parts of the game. This means a lot of combat scenarios involve you weaving and evading in a form of dance to get a few hits in here or there. I'm totally in on a lot of games with that type of dynamic. It's such an effective way for getting you to go from casually navigating the world, lean back in your chair, to full neck-forward gamer missionary. Admittedly, I'm pretty bad at using extra powers in games like this. I just want to use my default options more often than that, so even in a second playthrough when I was aware of other abilities like the ground pound, I still rarely use them in combat. Obviously that's more my problem than the game's, and it's not like I was particularly punished for it either. Is it my favorite game of all time? Not even remotely close. You saw my list for a moment earlier, but could I understand why it would be someone else's favorite game of all time? Without a second thought, yeah, definitely. There is one issue, though. I mentioned right at the beginning of this section that I've known Trevor the longest, and I figured it would be easy because of it. But I have to say, this is by far the most surprising answer I've gotten. I was thinking it could be this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or maybe this. I've heard him talk about all these games outwardly and conversationally so much more frequently that I was almost taken aback by receiving Hollow Knight. I mean, I've seen enough of this shit to kill a man, and often it has. Replaying Hollow Knight consisted a lot of trying to answer the why to myself. If you were paying attention to the few games I just flashed on screen, there are a few similarities, sure. I think you can make a blanket statement on maybe third-person designated roll button games, being able to maybe dump hundreds of hours in. Maybe a few bad Google searches away from being a furry. It didn't really click until I stopped considering video games as the anchor point, and moving forward, I want to be sure to do this for the rest of the games, and for the rest of my friends. Hollow Knight's a game that you play in a voice call with a friend or two, or maybe when no one else is around the voice channel at the moment. You woke up too early, too late. You want some challenge, but wouldn't mind platforming around to fill out the last few untouched parts of the world map. I think for a large portion of the time I've known Trevor, it's been a touch and go fluctuation of just wanting to hang out and sit around, watch some videos, listen to music, or alternatively go ham playing fighting games or other more active things. This was my admittedly poor initial conclusion, and I do want to avoid getting overly personal, which makes it even more difficult, because after all, I'm throwing this video out into the void where anyone can see it. Not that I really expect a lot of people to. I guess the short rundown to me is that Hollow Knight is an absurdly amazing game, and I think most people can get something out of it, but also, to me at least, it represents the extremity of what Trevor looks for in games, as well as how he's been as a friend I've spent an awful lot of time with over all these years. I'm going to make a confession in the very beginning before we get to the point of no return. I'm a Digimon kid. Now that you know I'm 7'4" and have 3 cheerleader girlfriends, let's talk about Pokemon Emerald. In some ways, like Trevor's pick before this, I didn't expect this selection from Dean. Unlike Trevor, however, it's because I haven't really ever discussed single-player games with him all that much. Where I've talked to and seen Trevor play dozens and dozens of single-player games, I could maybe name the completely single-player games I know Dean has played on one hand. At the end of the day, Dean plays just significantly more multiplayer or co-op games. Pokemon games, or rather, the property as a whole, requires no introduction, and it's really no surprise to appear as the favorite game of anyone that was born in the mid-90s onwards. Gonna be honest with you, this was probably going to be more so about older Pokemon games as a whole than individually Emerald, but I do see pretty often a common sentiment from people around my age that Emerald's just the most solid and content-filled version of the Game Boy era. I have played Sapphire, which Emerald is the culmination of Ruby and Sapphire, and when I said I played Sapphire, it was the only Game Boy Advance game I owned physically for quite a while, and I played it religiously because of that. Trico is still my favorite starter in the whole series, so it was a great relief I had an excuse to go for another round. Let's take a moment now to really appreciate probably the most infamous litmus test or potential bonding moment in gaming history, the starter you select. People that haven't made any friends yet will likely say it's this, but they're too busy editing wiki pages to ever see this, so starting a children's game with an irreversible choice is genuinely such an interesting and defining part of the franchise. When you're a kid, obviously you just pick the coolest looking one to you, and I want you to remember that sentiment, because we're going to come back to it at least one more time. For now, let's construct a little timeline in your brain. Go back to the schoolyard. You're waiting for your turn to let it rip and kickball, and you know that bastard's gonna roll it quick and bouncy, so while you're waiting, you talk to a couple other kids in line with you. Pokemon comes up. One of them also picked Cyndaquil, and you think, hey, we like the same things, we'd probably be good friends. Another kid says they picked Chikorita. You both scoot away a few steps. That guy is a weirdo. But we'll get back to that friend after this. Fast forward to high school or college, and you find yourself in a similar circumstance eating at the dining hall. You picked a different starter than me as a kid? Huh. Interesting, maybe I should replay the game legally with that one. I guess what I'm trying to point at is how starters are nearly a personality trait for a lot of people, and the implications of it have changed in my lifetime whenever it comes up. Similar to a goal of this video project, I wanted to try to guess which starter Dean picked as a kid, knowing him as a person for the last 12 years or something like that. I knew for sure he wouldn't pick Trico like me because we disagree on so many things, and Torchic didn't quite feel right either, so it left Mudkip, especially considering a shitposter like Dean surely saw a Mudkip or two on the iPod Touch iFunny app in his youth. And right here is the confirmation from the man himself. Could it have been blind luck on a 33% chance? Yeah, I guess, but let me feel this brief satisfaction. I could have picked Mudkip in this playthrough to make this full circle, but I can't betray my baby boy and just name my Trico Deans. I also want to get an elephant out of the video, as I'm sure a lot of people would notice it. I'm a criminal tier grinding over leveler. Pokemon surely was the origin of that for me because, like a lot of people my age, this cocky menace filtered me once as a child, and I went into a multiple day-long grinding frenzy. The ability to just spend a lot of time hitting left and right over and over again until you can mash A a bunch, in order to feel that later satisfaction of one-shotting someone's pet bird they've trained their entire lives with, is just Man. I'm not alone on this either. Plenty of RPGs with similar leveling systems, in particular monster collecting games, have even added more mechanics to let you grind even harder. I mentioned the series a bit earlier, so one example can be Digimon Cyber Sleuth, where the game will give you a lot of dungeons you can access whenever to grind materials, XP, money, eggs, as long as you want. Even better, the ability to force encounters makes it even faster, and when your Digimon level up, their HP and MP refills, so you almost never have to angrily walk back to a Poke Center so you can keep headbutting Pucciinas. Is that how you say that? Another big one that I wish Emerald had is this quirky little option in Cyber Sleuth to just cut out the animations. This is a grinding gamer's wet dream, and that's before considering all the family-friendly designs in this series. I know all genres evolve and get more accessible or convenient over time by themselves, but I'd be hard-pressed to say Pokemon didn't plant the seed in a lot of kids' goblin brains about power leveling that are now making RPGs as adults. It's also kind of convenient that these two franchises have bounced a lot of ideas off of one another over the decades, so this wasn't entirely for me to shill Cyber Sleuth. Now this is actually the first time I've emulated a real Pokemon game. I've only really tinkered with some fan-made randomizer games once in a while, and man, I gotta say, being able to just crank the emulation speed up and do this shit alleviated so much pain I had as a kid on my actual Game Boy. Pokemon games are a really interesting beast because I think it's one of the franchises in which you can feel nostalgic even if you've never played one before. Even then, the opening dialogue with Professor Birch was so unbelievably comforting because it's verbatim how I remembered it. I love how cleverly disguised so many things were back then that I never quite understood when I was younger. Here I am now, a couple college computer science and engineering courses later, and it should destroy the facade of that era of game design, but it just hasn't. I know that me entering my name into the startup of the game is just a stored series of values that's simply regurgitated when the time comes back into the text boxes. I know that entering the local time was just a benchmark for a simplistic day and night cycle. I know that boy or girl just changes my sprite and the symbol on my ID. If anything though, it just makes me appreciate the game even more and all the little things they did to build the world for you that you're a core member of. One thing I noticed for the first time was thinking as a kid I made so much money from being the first gym leader with a criminally overleveled Pokemon, only to, as an adult now, do the conversion and find that 1500 yen is just shy of 12 bucks. And speaking of gym leaders, I really wanted to focus on the NPCs in this game, or Pokemon games as a whole, I guess. I could probably count on one hand the number of NPCs that don't talk about Pokemon in some form. You'd think that would get really annoying in a video game to have people only talk about one thing, but this isn't really the case in Pokemon, to me at least. I too would probably converse about the shoulder-mounted cannon, 5'3" turtle that the flower shop down the block from me uses to water flowers if that was something I saw even on a daily basis. Pokemon is silly, but it knows it's silly. The same way I talked about starters being a talking point that people like in real life, the NPCs sort of do the same thing to the in-game character. Yeah man, you really like Nosepass. That's cool, I guess. Even with this simplicity, this makes the world feel so much more alive than it should be when every house you walk into is 1 to 4 people sitting at their kitchen table that's weirdly dead center of their living space. You can't help but wonder what's up with the NPCs that rapidly move up and down a couple spaces instead of standing still and waiting for me to talk to them like a good citizen. Trainers waiting at the routes are also something I didn't really appreciate at all until now at probably 26 years old when this video is finally uploaded. Some kid will shout in surprise, sprint at you like you're John Lennon on December 8th, 1980, tell you he's gonna beat your ass and he's worked so hard for this, then just has 4 Zigzagoons of the exact same level. As a kid, this admittedly just made me mad. Were the developers lazy? Could they not think of a cool, well-rounded team that a real person would have? Youthful arrogance aside, I adore this stuff now. They had 4 Zigzagoons because they liked Zigzagoon. If Pokemon was real, I'd only have my favorite Pokemon. I wouldn't have some dork-ass Wobbuffet so I can stall out Johnny Donuts down the block. I'd want my Aggron to do a really cool move before he gets insta-killed by any type of special attack. I'd cry if my Patrician Poliwhirl evolved into a lame Poliwrath or my Cubone into a Marowak because I wasn't paying enough attention to stop them. I told you we would return to this point, didn't I? As a kid, you picked the things that looked the coolest. Rock Tomb has a dope animation, I'll just use that over and over again, yeah. I don't really care about the not very effective message. You do the same as an adult though, but we add this layer of excuses and justification so we don't feel dumb or shallow. Aggron's competitively viable for some teams, I scream into the sky. His old voice lines were badass. He reminds me of this or that, but at the end of the day, I just like him. I'll use him no matter what. I think this was the strand I had to pull on to connect it all back to my buddy across the sea, Dean. Everyone, especially people like us that have spent a lot of time online, is to some degree opinionated. I myself think a lot of people would call me severely opinionated, and I would consider Dean a very opinionated person too, and I don't want that to sound negative or derogatory or anything, because it isn't. As long as I've known Dean, he's been very all in on the things he likes and, quite the opposite on those he doesn't. If I didn't dump raw recording videos every couple of months from my drives, I'd insert a supercut of playing Dota 2 with him on voice right now, where you can experience the entire range of that love-hate spectrum. Sure, you could argue MOBAs as a whole are a tug of war wanting to do the cool thing with your cool favorite character, just being ripped away from the fun by their lame-ass character doing lame things. More than most people I know, Dean just wants to do the things he likes. He isn't gonna waste his time playing types of games he knows he doesn't like, or eating what he doesn't want to eat, which is pretty interesting since he completely lives off of monster energy. He'll say what he wants to say, regardless of the repercussions, or rather in spite of the repercussions. I can respect that attitude, as personally I'm someone who will do stuff I really don't want to do just to spend some more time with my friends. Pokemon Emerald, or Pokemon games as a whole, are games that you can almost exclusively do what you want. Nobody forces you to use a Pokemon you visually hate, or to read the paper-thin story, or to use a move you don't think is cool. Will you fare well on the Pokemon Showdown ladder? Well, probably not, but who cares? It's satisfying to clear a game with only the things you like. It's like getting all your favorite items and powers in a roguelike run. It was fun going through Pokemon Emerald. To be honest, I was kind of fearing that the magic would be lost on me all these years later, but it just wasn't. I got to mow through the whole game, doing and using things that I liked, and I can only assume that's what Dean's been doing the whole time. We've reached the Chikorita Kid. I've known Billy nearly as long as I've known Dean, which is kind of weird considering Dean lives across the world on an online forum, whereas Billy grew up maybe 10 minutes from me. This was the least surprising answer I got in this part of the project, though that isn't to say I didn't maybe expect some other titles instead. Something about Wario Land 4 just sort of made sense, and I had never seen, let alone played any of these games before the time of making this. Wario was a character I tended to avoid in all Nintendo games I'd play at friends' houses. He just sort of grossed me out at a base level, and I found his design and demeanor just irritating. For the Street Fighter heads out there, I equate him greatly to Rufus Energy. The only Wario thing I've actively played was the copy of WarioWare that came bundled with my Wii when I finally got one a few years after the launch as my first ever Nintendo console, and I don't really know how Wario-y that game is. So while I may never understand Wario enjoyers or Chikorita pickers, I was more than willing to try out a game of a good longtime friend. It also feels a bit weird that now, finally 3 games into this, I get a game that I have no experience with, so I think maybe this could come off a little more review-oriented as a result. One thing that I may have experienced in my modern game brain rot, or maybe not modern since it goes back probably most popular with Metroid, I expected to have all the movement and attack abilities taken away from me after the early tutorial demonstrating them in rapid succession. They were not, however, and I realized I didn't really commit them to memory, having assumed I'd be reunited later and have time to really solidify their use. This made the first few levels in the game hardest of all to me, since I'd forget things like being able to crouch, then jump to squeeze through the small raised gaps in some walls. In some way though, this was a bit of a blessing because it crystallized pure frustration at the very beginning of the game so I could sort of naturally cool off as the time went on. That being said, it almost feels intentional in the earlier levels of any of the 4 main colors in the hub. Intentional in the sense that just plopping a lot of the core mechanics in, such as the aforementioned hold crouch jump, rolling, or necessary momentum level to break through certain blocks to make sure you master and recognize their application system-wide. This doesn't even involve the stage-specific gimmicks that are generously sprinkled throughout. I actually want to talk about the aesthetic and style of the game first, and it feels a little more appropriate considering my pal Billy. If I didn't change my mind between writing this and actually assembling the footage, you saw a bit of the opening of the game at the beginning of the section. From that alone and any footage you've seen of the actual game thus far, I don't think anyone would argue that the game's oozing with style. One thing I noticed is the sort of clash in the style. Unlike Billy, I don't happen to have any sort of art experience or upbringing, so I'm sure this little section will sound incredibly basic, but I'll work with what I have. To me, the style of Wario Land 4 is an uncanny clash of realism, yet absurd cartoonishness, if that makes sense. Some textures, especially in the backgrounds and platforms of many stages, are very realistic in terms of the pixel art of the era, in particular the grassy overgrown stages. There's beautiful little dark pockets, like cracks in walls, or behind dense foliage, or in between large sets of rocks you aren't really sure whether or not you can break. Other levels can head in the opposite direction, like the violently colorful toy stages that may or may not feature some of the most aggravating puzzles of all time. Meanwhile, in the foreground, Wario and some enemies can look absolutely absurd and cartoonish in comparison. The collision of a detailed, lush forest in the background with a sweaty, presumably, bee-stung, inflated Wario trying to float to a platform high up is almost unsettling, in a good way. Don't even get me started on how much character and charm is in the animations of just Wario alone. I can certainly appreciate the abundance of art they just crammed into this game. With so much variety packed in, there were definitely some stages I can still picture in my head quite clearly because they just appealed to me significantly more. I'm sure a lot of fans of this game, or even series I'd imagine, enjoy talking about which their favorite stages are. I suppose the violent thrashing of style and theme every stage could be a little much for some people, but since it's just me on the mic right now, it's really cool and you legally cannot refute that. I think the only kind of backhanded compliment I could give is that some stages the pixel art is just too good and made it a little hard to see stuff, but that's just such a nitpick it's pointless to even complain about. I'm also not sure how me playing on a 24-inch monitor via emulation changes things visually compared to the intended Game Boy Advance screen. I mentioned a bit in the beginning that I did actually initially have a little trouble with the game mechanically, even at times outright despising some of the levels. While there's still a few levels I'd prefer to never see again in my entire life, a vast majority of the discomfort, again, was just how I shot through the tutorial and didn't really commit anything to memory at first. At the very least, I've learned I'll have to pay much better attention to any tutorials future games I do have. Back on track, once I eventually got through a handful of levels, it really began to click for me. It becomes a lot more visually recognizable when and how I can use Wario's basic movement options and attacks to navigate the stages, many of which can really favor some fun momentum tricks to just blast through areas and enemies. Speaking of enemies, I really love how they handle enemies in this game. Initially, I was pretty frustrated with their placement and the ailments they would inflict, such as making Wario incredibly heavy and slow, or a goopy zombie, or a bat. These, however, are actually way more akin to power-ups, helping you to navigate the level, unlock little side areas, or even main ones, which once I picked up on, completely changed it to a positive impression. For some reason they remind me of little dudes that drop cards in a game I can't quite remember the name of. The gradual accumulation of knowledge even had me go back to a few stages earlier in the various color areas to see how quickly I could get through them now that I had a better grasp on how to move. If you recall some of my favorite games way back in the beginning of the video, I think it's pretty apparent how much I value weight and speed more than most aspects in a game. We'll certainly talk about that more in detail at some point, but it's important that when I look back on my experience with Wario Land 4. You see, maybe it's not the fact that I didn't absorb the tutorial, but rather the very initial dislike of the game was due to my love for momentum. And that's because I didn't know how to move at first. Full props to Nintendo, they perfected, as far as I'm aware, the feeling of being a guy as wide as he is tall. Though I don't plan on getting myself to that point to really compare. The point being, if you just try to move Wario like a generic platforming character, he feels incredibly lethargic, or almost sticky even. And of course this is how I was initially trying to move him. Once you really start to understand when and where to use things like the shoulder charge, roll, and jump, however, all of a sudden Wario becomes this lubed up wrecking ball with the uncanny ability to smash through huge piles of garbage or rocks like he's a bologna-scented Sonic the Hedgehog. Getting better at barreling through the stages was definitely my favorite part of the game. It was genuinely a huge relief that I figured it all out by the end and came to really enjoy it in most ways. Though I have to admit, there's a part of me that thinks it would be really funny to blow it out of proportion and pretend I hate the game outright. Maybe a future game will let me live out this fantasy. Since I like tethering these game playthroughs to my own interests and favorites instead of having a direct game comparison like the previous two, it reminds me of a phenomenon I haven't really had the pleasure of experiencing yet at least a couple years. Likely in the generic dad-given advice hall of fame is the phrase practice makes perfect. The ultimate reality that things that we haven't really tried before are going to feel strange, alien, unnatural. One of the first such experiences, well, learning to walk as a baby. But I'm not a baby, I'm a man, so let's move it forward into video games. Arguably my most played genre, fighting games have seemingly never been able to escape the accusation that they're just too hard to learn and feel really awkward. While they are difficult in plenty of ways, it's forever been puzzling to me at least that inputs and movements always come up. Things like air dashes, back dashes, FD braking, hyper hopping, so on, are just like any other thing and become completely natural after even just a day or two of playing with your friends. Until that point though, it'll probably feel just outright bad to you. Other examples that come to mind include edge panning or dragging an overhead map in a MOBA or RTS game, annihilating your hands with the plethora of popular rhythm game controllers, style swapping effectively in Devil May Cry or another similar character action game, bunny hopping and circle jumping in arena shooters like Quake or Reflex, or maybe being able to keep all the blood inside your body while you're playing Ultra Kill. What do all these things have in common? They feel absolutely incredible once you can do them consistently and effectively, way more than they were frustrating at the beginning. It's a similar feeling to that infamous elation many people experience in the Souls series when they finally clear a boss or area. Since I've been playing all those things I just mentioned as examples for many years now, that experience of hating how something feels in my hands was sort of filed away in a back shelf. Wario Land 4 dusted off the cover, and honestly I'm kind of embarrassed I let it get the better of me in my first 2 to 3 hours of the game. Here I am at the end of the tunnel though, and I just respect the game quite a lot mechanically after powering through it all. It seems like it's about time to wrap it up and bring this back to Billy. Wario Land 4 really put me through a roller coaster of emotion the time I spent with it, and I'm certainly happy it pulled into the station on a positive note. Despite being good friends with Billy for quite a while, it'd be pretty irresponsible of me to pretend like we aren't near opposites on plenty of things. One example would be that with the exception of the best non-fighting game released in 2022, I admittedly despise speedrunning to any capacity, not even for a particular reason. I know Billy really enjoys watching speedruns of all sorts of games, and looking at my time in this game, I can really see how it would apply well to a game like Wario Land 4. I mentioned previously that I went back to mess with earlier levels, and I imagine someone who's really into speedrunning can get the most out of a structure like that. Another example would be as someone not particularly into visual design, even though I enjoyed the look of most of the game, there were certainly things that are a little too weird or gross or artistic for me. I know Billy responds really well to incredibly unique, creative, colorful things, so it was easy to tell from the jump it was a really appealing aspect for him. If I had to maybe crudely illustrate our preference in games, it's kind of funny how we both sort of miss out on the middle ground of genre, so to speak, so let me try to demonstrate it here. I guess the point is, even the things that weren't for me could be sort of placed in a comfy isolation box, knowing they were certainly for somebody else. I think playing through this game really painted an important lesson for this video series for however long I'm willing to stick with it. While Billy and I may like a lot of very different things, whether it be game genres, food, music, whatever really, at the end of the day we've been good friends regardless. This runs parallel with my experience with his favorite game, Wario Land 4. While there were times and aspects that really rubbed me the wrong way, it was still definitely a net good experience, and I'm happy I took the time to play through it all. I think a lot of people can worry that they don't have perfect overlap with a friend or significant other. It's more than alright to not have that, considering I've spent a large amount of time with Billy over the last handful of years, and it only makes conversation and stuff much more interesting. Everyone has experienced sharing a video or song or game with a friend and they end up bouncing off of it. I wouldn't say I bounced off of Wario Land 4 aside the first couple hours, and far from it. That is to say, it's a deeply creative and playful video game, just like my friend Billy. Alright fellas, it's time for my favorite game of all. I wanted to talk about one of my favorite games at the end of every part of this project, and since it was the first part of the video in the series, I wanted to do what I generally consider my favorite game of all time, Armored Core: Last Raven. It felt incredibly out of place, however, when standing next to the games I covered in this part, which were 2 platformers and 2 RPGs. I already mentioned the Megaman Zero series during the Hollow Knight section as well. Also, I know it's kind of cheating to say the entire Megaman Zero series, and it bounces between 3 and 2 in particular in my case, but you'll just have to accept this and move on. I'm not a contrarian enough to say the first game is my favorite, because man, that game was not made for people to play and do well in. 4 is also the one I've played the least besides the ZX games, so realistically it'll mostly be about the second and third entries of the series. The 4th game, however, did have a lot of goofy add-ons like the fist weapon to steal enemy powers in a rather Kirby-like way, and the chip crafting system and weather systems. Mega Man as a franchise is one that myself, as well as others I've met, ask the question, how the hell did I beat this multiple times as a kid? As you'll be able to see in the footage here, I'm using the checkpoint system that's in the Zero collection on PC and I think other consoles. These didn't exist in the old games, and I'd like to assure you that I have beaten all 4 of the main Zero games on that classic style, just now I don't really see a reason to not use the checkpoints when I get the urge to plow through one of the games on a random day. What is it I like so much about Zero as a character? Mega Man himself is one of the most recognizable video game characters of all time, surely standing up with the greats like Master Chief or Cloud or Mario for even people that may not play or consume much video game anything could probably name. Zero, on the other hand, is only in some of the games for the main spin-off branch, the Mega Man X games. Hell, X is dead in the Zero series for all intents and purposes, and his name still comes first in the game title. Sure, Zero's not an obscure gaming character by any means, but for people like me that are massive fans of him, he's the representation of the franchise itself more than the titular protagonist. He's even made a name for himself in some non-side-scrolling titles, and can even help out the Blue Bomber in Smash as an assist trophy. I'll get to gameplay and actual game stuff eventually, I promise, but I want to provide as much as I can about one of my favorite game characters of all time. As mentioned earlier, we meet Zero in the very first legendary stage of one of the most famous Mega Man games of all, Mega Man X for the SNES. When the player, as X, can't defeat Vile, Zero steps in to save us. He's the appointed leader of the Maverick Hunters after Sigma, the primary antagonist of the X game series, becomes a Maverick himself. Mavericks are essentially enemies of the humans, whether through their own personal free will and decisions, or more than often bugs or viruses, as they're primarily Reploids or fully sentient cyborgs. After being created by humans and used for both good and evil, these Reploids decide that humans are indeed inferior and weaker than them, and they should have the power themselves. X may be the first Reploid ever created, though that was before the term even existed, but Zero is considered the strongest, and the creation of the antagonist of the original Mega Man series. Zero was created for destructive, malicious purposes, yet possessed such a strong sense of self that after a few more plot elements later, ultimately is fighting for the good guys to stop the rampaging Mavericks. After it all though, we discover that Zero has been unknowingly spreading the Maverick virus created by Dr. Wily all that time ago. He was built for evil, fought for good, but ultimately still caused nothing but destruction. Such is the path for Zero for everything before Mega Man Zero, someone who wants to do good but is often unable due to the poor hand he's always dealt. He loses his body multiple times, he loses Iris, his love interest, even dying in the canonical ending of Mega Man X5 to his best friend, X. He's sealed away for research, which eventually will lead us to the Mega Man Zero games. Awoken 100 years later by the human CL, or not that one, Zero is told that the copy of X is leading a violent Reploid organization, Neo Arcadia. I won't get too into the plot of the Zero series either, but things are really different. You're the legendary hero of history, but you feel so incredibly alone, and the tone of the games are much more bleak than any series before. It's also accentuated by how difficult a lot of sections of these games can be, especially the first game. My man got a nap for 100 years and is right back into terrible circumstances, and still has to sacrifice himself in the end of the fourth game, after giving one of the most rent-free dialogue lines I've ever read in a game. I think people that know me personally know I'm very, very attached to the struggling type protagonist, and maybe on a character level, by default, I'm just going to prefer Zero series to the main line in the X series because it features just that. And his Zero series design is so goddamn amazing. Alright, I'll get to the gameplay now. I'm sorry. As I've hinted at a few times prior, the Zero series is pretty infamous for its relative difficulty, though I would say 3 and 4 are noticeably easier than the first two. While a lot of things like faster boss attacks, tighter platforming, and brutal gameplay mechanics that they hardly explain anything about certainly play a role, Zero himself is likely the biggest factor. Let's look at playing as Mega Man or X in the other games and how different it feels. With X, the ranged weapons really place an emphasis on vertical positioning, good timing, and often patience due to the relatively low damage. There's often time to really slow the game pace down and just try to play as smart and efficiently as possible. Though that's easier said than done, since I'd imagine it's uncontroversial to say the Mega Man series as a whole gets a lot of its luster from difficulty. With Zero, however, your limited range means you have to get in there and get out, which is something I discussed a little bit in the Hollow Knight section. A dance of well-timed hops and dashes in and out of enemies and hazards is such a rhythmic and enjoyable way to play a game. This also means getting closer to bosses to get your swings in, which at any time they can start an animation or move, which will result in you taking plenty of damage. I know what you're thinking, though, if you've been watching the footage, Zero does have some ranged weapons in the Mega Man Zero series. This is where I want to introduce you to the ranking system, the stinger of this series of Game Boy Advance games. While certainly tuned down by the end of the series, time to complete stages is a massive factor in your rank. In most games, you need typically an A or higher rank to guarantee you get the EX skills from bosses, some of which can be very impactful for your late game difficulty. Other factors include stuff like damage taken, number of enemies defeated, which you'll also likely get a B or C if you don't really deal with all the stats as best as you can. I'm not going to hide the fact that a lot of my Zero runs I have an A only for the first few stages, then ride the B train to the end. This is what makes the ranged weapons sort of a double-edged sword. They do not generally do great damage and are primarily for preemptively peppering some damage into enemies before you barrel through with the Z-Saber. You don't have time to waste on hanging back and killing enemies with ranged weapons like the Z-Buster or Chain Rod. You better keep moving forward. The upside is that you can go back to missions you've already completed later to slowly look for chips or sub-tanks, but that first completion is the grade you'll have on the stage forever, and that rank carries over. This, essentially, timer keeps the pressure on you to keep navigating and killing as smoothly and efficiently as physically possible. I know this is going to sound like some dumb anime shit, but forcing the player to barrel through with a simultaneous balance of recklessness yet fear is the most, canon tethering thing in the world, and I can't gush about it enough. After all, you're the miserable legendary hero himself, Zero. The first to throw your body on the line, but aware at the end of the day, you're the only one that can get it done. X isn't here to back you up, nor is Axel or Iris or the Colonel. Nobody. The game is so frantic and hot-blooded mechanically, yet so chilling in distance with the atmosphere and story. I must admit I feel pretty underqualified to do a pseudo-review of the game series or even a single game in the series despite the number of time I've played the games. I basically only used the Z-Saber and Z-Buster, with the exception of sometimes the Recoil Rod in 3, which is one of the most interesting and versatile weapons in any side-scroll platformer I've ever played. I also don't really ever equip or fuse elves, the collectibles that you can use for various effects like increasing your health pool, shooting projectiles, blocking projectiles, prevent spike damage, etc. Weapons like the Chain Rod, Shield Boomerang, Triple Rod, or Zero Knuckle are nearly untouched by me, but I'm more than sure they're definitely for someone. Alternate weapons are always nice to have for people that need an extra variable to really click in with. If not for Bilio's Wario Land pick, I would say this is one of the most weirdly experimental platform side-scrollers I've ever played due to the sheer volume of, quote, see what sticks that Capcom did between the games. That being said, I'd consider the two games weird in a totally different way. While something like Wario Land had a lot of fun little gimmicks per stage to keep it fresh and really engaging, the Zero series would just fully change the core system mechanics between them. In Zero 1, you had to really grind your weapon usage up to unlock their full potential and their moveset, which was very hard if you wanted to get the A or S rank completion for the time. In Zero 2, the grinding was cut down a lot, and the two games after that just sort of said, screw it, here's all your stuff. But here are totally new mechanics. 4 is definitely the most out of left field, but it does honestly make this series feel kinda inconsistent. They're all excellent games, that's for sure, but to me at least it doesn't really feel like the way a numbered series usually progresses mechanically. I don't know what else to really say that won't lead me down another 15-minute tangent. I just really love this series, man. If you don't mind having to retry stages and boss fights over and over, even with the collection port checkpoints, I really couldn't recommend the games enough. Though, admittedly, I'd probably tell you to start with 2 or 3, then go back to 1, even as sacrilegious as that sounds. I'm also a person that tells people to watch some OVAs from the Gundam Universal Century before 0079, so take that as you will. Oh yeah, one last thing to mention, Capcom's sound department is rightfully one of the most iconic and influential in all of video games. They went absolutely crazy with this series. I can't tell you how many times I've listened to tracks like Esperanto, Cannonball, Departure, Falling Down, so many more while exercising. If the collection ever goes on sale on Steam or whatever consoles it's on, maybe consider picking it up. God knows I've sent plenty of copies of it that nobody ever opens. Oh, also, if you're really into the Megaman series already, and I really recommend checking out 30XX on Steam if you want a game that feels like Mega Man X or Mega Man Zero, but with roguelike aspects. I hope you enjoyed hearing me ramble incoherently about games my friends and myself really like, especially if you're one of the friends I talked about in this. This took a long time to make, though partially out of procrastination, so there will be more parts eventually. Play your best friend's game this winter, or see me in Melty Blood. Thanks.